Hi, Misha here, and I thought it would be fun to talk about the F-16 Fighting Falcon in Israeli Air Force service, because I actually have 3 new models, including one that just came out from Hobby Master, and including this one from Aikens. It's one of their exclusive with the extra stuff here. And have a pretty good assortment from a couple Netz, what they called the early versions, and then a couple of the Baraks, which is the equivalent of a CD version. And I don't actually have a Sufa, but standing in for it we have something very close, which is the Polish, but it's the take, the same block of aircraft, 52. So you can pretend like it's got some pythons under it. That would be the major physical difference besides markings. And these really do span 3 decades of purchase, and they've been in service. Really, outside of the USA, Israel has been the largest user of the F-16, and actually 2/3 of its air-to-air victories have been accredited to Israeli flown examples. So it plays a very large part, frankly. So with that, we'll just kind of get into it. Giora Epstein is really one of the most famous and most successful aces of the jet era. And that's why I guess Aikens did this kind of limited run version, and Hobby Master Jet here. This is a late model F-16A or Netz, circa 1997. Nothing terribly special about it in and of itself, except for the markings and paint job. But Epstein was born in 1938, May 20. He's actually still alive today. He entered into military service in Israel in 1956, but not as a pilot. He actually started off as a paratrooper, at least very soon in his career, and became quite successful. And then he would retire after serving 2 years, go back to civilian life, but would then come back to military life. He really wanted to be a pilot, but early on he wasn't allowed for various health reasons. But he fought it and kept taking the test. Eventually he was cleared. It seemed to be a heart issue that was considered not to be that big of a deal, frankly. Originally he was cleared to be a pilot of a rotary wing aircraft, a helicopter, which he did for a time, qualified on it. But essentially he just kept bugging the crap out of his superiors until finally he was sent to fighter training school and would eventually go into service, and would first fly the Mirage III, built by Dassault in France, and getting his first air-to-air victory during the Six-Day War on June 6, 1967. And from there, he would first shoot down an Su-7, a fighter bomber. Then he would actually take on a true fighter with a MiG-17, and then his 4th and 5th kills would end up being MiG-21s, which at that time were cutting-edge fighters. He would continue to serve, eventually being promoted to more of a commander officer's position, and he would be in that position when the Yom Kippur War began in 1973. But after initially serving at headquarters, he petitioned and was allowed to go back into the cockpit, flying a squadron. This time he would fly the Nesher, an Israeli unlicensed copy of the Mirage 5, and he would again have quite some success during that war. He would shoot down 8 aircraft with the Mirage 3, and he would shoot down 9 with the Nesher, meaning that he has a total kill count of 17 credited to him. And he would be in active military service up till 1977, at which time, yeah, he's getting a little up there in years, nearly 40. and so he would retire out of active service, yet he would continue on as a reserve officer. His day job would be flying for Israeli Airlines and then doing his weekend duties as such. And then actually on his birthday, May 20th, in 1997, he would take his final flight. His last couple of decades would be flying the F-16, although I don't believe, well, he never had any kills in it as such. He would retire out at the rank of colonel, and then after retirement, he would be honorarily promoted to brigadier general. I believe it was around 2006. And that's why they have done a couple of versions for him. It's a shame that Hobbymaster doesn't do a Mirage 3, because that would have been a good one to do for him. But since this is a replica of his final flight, that'll work as well. So with that as kind of the impetus behind this video, now let's talk about the versions of the Fighting Falcon that Israel used in the whole Peace Marble program, which really runs Peace Marble 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 over 2 decades, where they get it from the USA. Here we have the one model you have seen before. This is an Israeli-operated Netz Hawk, their name for the F-16A and Bs. These were all Block 10, or at least upgraded to Block 10 standard. And this dates back to 1978, at which time Washington, D.C., under the Carter administration, was quite happy with Israel because of making peace with Egypt, who they'd had a long-standing conflict with, including with Epstein's kills there. Well, Egypt was changing sides. It kind of realized that being backed by the comm block wasn't working out for them, so things were cooling there and heating up for the West in a good way. And so Israel made peace, yada yada. They were in good stead, and this led to Peace Marble 1 as it happened. And Israel would purchase some F-15s and would want 75 F-16s, a very new plane for that time. The F-15 was a great air superiority fighter, but the F-16 was cheaper, so they could buy more, and was a multi-role fighter, so they could use it for, well, multi-roles. And because of the events in Iran, that order was canceled in 1979, meaning the aircraft were available sooner than perhaps originally anticipated. So the first ones were officially handed over in January of 1980, with really the full coming into real service in July of 1980, and soon becoming operationally ready. And it would not take long before Israel would start making waves with their nets. In April of 1981, the F-16 would get its first kill worldwide. This would be against Syrian assets and whatnot. And in June, they would become famous or infamous when there would be the raid on the Osirak reactor in Iraq, which is what this model is here. 8 F-16As were flown with escort of 6 F-15s. Each F-16 carried 2 2,000-pound high-explosive bombs, unguided. And they actually made a very long trip, over 1,000 miles, which is officially beyond the range of the aircraft, but they pushed the envelope. They actually flew a lot of it quite at low level, sometimes not much more than 100 meters above the ground, to kind of sneak in under radar. Well, they hit the plant at dusk. No Israeli fighters were lost, and the reactor was severely damaged. 8 workers were killed, and it definitely put Iraq's nuclear program, whatever it might have been, kind of behind. Israel thought they were developing nuclear weapons. Iraq insisted it was for power. Regardless, you get the idea. Of course, internationally this was a problem because Israel had promised to only use the F-16s for defense. Of course, they claimed it was defense of a preemptive nature. Well, the Reagan administration, new to office at the time, A, did condemn it, and B, did stop F-16 deliveries for a time. They had received about 52. And they halted it there temporarily. But on the other hand, Reagan actually praised the preemptive strike and its execution and daringness. It wasn't long, though, before he was able to lift the embargo, as it were. So by August, September of 1981, Israel got its final batch of the first F-16s for Peace Marble 1. And from there, they were kind of emboldened. In 1982, they launched strikes into Lebanon against PLO camps, and they warned Syria, but Syria got involved. Some more air-to-air victories, including going up against MiG-21s. In fact, the F-16's first air-to-air victory was against a MiG-21 in Israeli service, going up against a Syrian one. They would also go up against the newer MiG-23, and there would be quite a bit of back and forth, and about half of all aircraft shot down by Israeli pilots in this conflict in Lebanon would be from the F-16, and Israeli pilots really enjoyed it. Now, these were basically Block 10 aircraft, but they did have some customizations. Most importantly, Israel had new chaff and flare dispensers for defense installed, countermeasures, as well as a few avionics changes, but overall they operated using standard ordnance, including the AIM-9 Sidewinder and unguided bombs. And Israel would use them in both roles. The F-4 Phantom was kind of their fighter bomber. The F-15 was the air superiority fighter. Well, their F-16 was kind of the swing fighter. They could do anything. And yeah, this one here is from the reactor raid. It's very much just a early Block 10, circa 1981. So it serves the purpose of, just that. With that, let's move on to the next program. Peace Marble 2 talks would begin in 1986, and the first aircraft would be delivered in 1987. In September, they would get their first F-16C single seat, and in December, they would get their first F-16D two-seater. Now, this was known as the Barak Lightening in Israeli service. Now, this model here is of a D circa 2006, and so it does have the updates like the JDAMs. And Peace Marble 2 was to be essentially for the next generation of F-16s, the Block 30-32 series. In fact, this one is a Block 30, as it has the larger General Electric engine. Block 32 planes would have the Pratt & Whitney engine. This is the first series to offer both. The Block 30 had several updates, including able to use the AIM 120. It could use the earlier targeting pods, primarily for day operation, expanded role. They would acquire 51 single-seat and 24 two-seaters, and they quickly discovered that the two-seater was great, not to use it really as a trainer, but more for a fighter-bomber, using the back-seater for weapons, or even as a wild weasel. When being used as a wild weasel, the D models, well, the back-seater was there to get in on the navigation, weapons, and they would eventually rework these to even use the Israeli Hawkeye missile, first used on the F-4 that they flew. Now, It's a little interesting about this model from Hobby Master. It has the dorsal spine. And while that is correct for Israeli F-16Ds, in fact, they were the first models to really feature this. This is for added avionics, electronics, countermeasures, and even a little bit of extra fuel. It's debatable if that should be on the 30 here, Block 30, or if it should be on our next one. It's also possible it was upgraded and received the spine retroactively. Let me know, because I'm not sure. Hobby Collector says this one is from Peace Marble 2, which would make it a Block 30. By the way, the C's were delivered a little bit earlier than the D's, so it's possible. On the other hand, it could be from Peace Marble 3. Here we have the recent release from Hobby Master. This is of Barak II from Peace Marble 3. Peace Marble 3 talks began in 1988, with deliveries running from 91 through 93. And this time, they purchased 30 single-seat and 32-seaters, still considered C and D versions, but now we're into the Block 40 series. And these are called the Night Falcon because they use lantern pods here, 2 pods, one for more navigation, one for laser targeting. These would be the first ones that came from the factory able to guide air-to-surface munitions, although of course earlier ones could be retrofitted. This one does have the AIM 120, the AMRAAM on the wings. And it does feature the Python missile, which is an Israeli thing that they updated their aircraft to work. That's their kind of medium-range missile that they prefer. And it's got JDAMs. And one neat thing about the newer Hobby Masters is you can, with the new stand, you can display it with the centerline fuel tank. Unfortunately, with the older models, even if you put them on the new stand, the door closed doesn't have the slot to peg in the centerline tank, because when they made those, the stand didn't exist. So even if you put one on, you can't have your centerline tank. Something just to point out. But with the newer ones that plug into the back here, you can do it. But yeah, this was Israel getting the new Block 40s with nighttime capability and a few other modernizations and updates. These are also the first to have GPS link up. And Israeli pilots really liked the Barak and the Barak II. They liked the speed, the accuracy, the updates. It was a very popular aircraft in the Israeli service. So this adds to the fleet. We've got 75 of the original. We've got 75 more. And now we have 60. So we're up to a total of 210 aircraft. And for the 1991 Gulf War, Israel sat it out. Even though Iraq did launch Scud missiles against them, they did not retaliate, which is exactly what the U.S. wanted because of its alliance with other Middle East nations. And this actually worked out really well for Israel. I should also mention that going back to 1988, the first time that Israel took the F-16C into combat was to attack some what they considered terrorist camps south of Beirut. So they're still using these very actively, and it didn't take them long to put them into service after receiving them in the 80s. With that, let's move on to our next program. To talk about Peace Marble 4, let's put Epstein's aircraft back up here. Why not? Like I said, the U.S. was happy that Israel kind of played it cool during the war. So in 1991, an agreement was signed, Peace Marble 4, for the U.S. to deliver 50 surplus U.S. Air Force F-16As and Bs to them. And these are relatively low flight hour examples, but they were Block 1, Block 5, some of them originally, but all had been long updated to Block 10 standard. And so the U.S. would kind of work towards that. In 1992, though, Israel would upgrade their existing F-16As and Bs, their Netz, giving them a new wing, new computers, some new avionics, some new sensors and antennas, and updating them to work with Israeli-specific weapons as well as just more modern weapons. And the U.S. would deliver the 50 planes as promised between August and December 1994. They would still have the gray U.S. Air Force low visibility camo. Of course, later they would get the Israeli camo, but for a while they flew in the gray. And Israel would designate these as Netz II, and they would upgrade them as well. But they planned to mostly keep these in reserve and mostly use them for training, qualification, that kind of thing. Because by this time they have the C's and the D's and other new things. But it is worth pointing out that the upgrades that Israel performed on their Netz brought them mostly up to F-16C standard, although they retained some of the older things, for example, their original Pratt & Whitney engines, what have you. So they were kind of a hybrid between AB and CD, I guess you could say. So Israel's fleet is expanding, but it still wasn't enough. At least that's what they felt. So in 1997, announcements were made for the next program forward. With that, let's get into the 21st century. Like I said, this is actually a Polish F-16D, but it's the correct Block 52 plus, so it'll work. Well, the program, which would eventually be known as Peace Marble 5, began in 1997 when Israel announced it wanted to retire the F-4s, the remaining A-4s, and the first generation of F-16s eventually. And it said it would need 50 to 100 new aircraft to replace them. And they talked with the USA, and in 1998 the USA proposed that for $2.5 billion, the Israelis could purchase either 30 F-15Is, the version that they'd already purchased, which was essentially an F-15E Strike Eagle, which is a multirole version which had ground attack, or 60 of the next generation of F-16s. Now, the Block 50-52 was introduced in 1991 with upgraded GPS, upgraded weapons access, better night capabilities, newer electronics, etc., etc. But it was the 50-52 Plus, which came out nearly a decade later, that really was of more interest. It made the spine in the back a standard feature, and it made conformal fuel tanks, which are removable, a standard. And these are great because that freed up the two wing stations. Of course, you could carry fuel tanks there too and have lots of range. And of course, they were compatible out of the gate with the newest weapons and GPS and all that good stuff. And the U.S. said, well, $2.5 billion, you can do 30 of these, 60 of these, or you can mix and match. And Israel was going to use its U.S. foreign aid bank account to pay for these, And realizing, heck, this is not even our money we're spending, they upped the ante to $4 billion in 1999 and asked Boeing and Lockheed to submit proposals. And they tried out the new conformal fuel tanks, and they really like these because that gave the F-16 essentially the range of the F-15, and it was still cheaper. They could get more, and it was a very flexible aircraft. So in 2000, they announced their decision to purchase 50 customized Block 52 Plus aircraft. Note that these had the Pratt & Whitney engine, whereas earlier their aircraft had the General Electric, at least up until for the Baraks and Barak IIs. But anyway, they would say it would be customized, and they would purchase 50 with an option to purchase up to 60 more later. It would have a lot of Israeli-made custom hardware, including the conformal fuel tanks. It would also have Israeli-made avionics, electronics. In fact, as much as 50% would end up being sourced from Israel, so the aircraft would be delivered not complete as such. Well, towards the end of summer 2001, they exercised the option to add more to the order. They added 52 for a total of 102. Interestingly, these were all F-16D two-seaters. They liked the back seat for its multi-role capability, flexibility, and there really wasn't any reason not to. And you can kind of see this. Their orders of two-seaters have increased, and their orders of single seats have decreased over time. And the first ones, and these were known as the Sufa, meaning storm, they were worked on, and the first one was rolled out and presented in November of 2003, and the first two were actually delivered in February of 2004, and from that point on, they would receive them until 2009, and then finally the order was complete, meaning that a total of 362 F-16s would be in Israeli Air Force service over time. And the F-16 Block 52 Plus is quite an impressive aircraft. It really is. It had a lot of new features and just really was a mature design. Poland received theirs between 2006 and 2009, so kind of the same time frame as the Israeli aircraft. By the way, this was the Israeli version, would have been known as the F-16I, again the Sufa, and they were able to start putting these into frontline units and also continue updating their older aircraft, much like the U.S. had done the F-16C++. Well, they would upgrade their F-16Cs and Ds to a modern standard as well. And of course their F-16Is would carry the Python missile and could have the JDAM or other guided munitions. So yeah, this Polish one fits okay. Hobbymaster has done, I think, 2 releases of the F-16I, but not any recently. So yeah, this works. And I do like the look with the tanks and everything. It's just a very different approach for the F-16 here. And there you have Peace Marble 5. So let's wrap things up and talk about 21st century service. Let's take the Epstein plane off the stand. You can see here there's no slot for the centerline tank with the closed doors. There is a slot for the open wheels down, but yeah. Of course, there's also a fill-in for the stand hole. This one just has the 2,000-pound bombs, tanks, and a total of 4 earlier AIM-9B, could be L, sidewinders. But yeah, like I said, these were upgraded beginning in '92, and then they received more from the U.S. Air Force. and they were mostly kept around into the 21st century as advanced trainers and auxiliary aircraft. Finally, in 2015, they were pulled from service, both the Netz and Netz IIs, and in 2016 there was a formal retirement ceremony because this aircraft definitely served with distinction in Israel, and they pushed it to its limit for an early F-16 and did very well with it. Now, early F-16s like these were not built to handle targeting pods or navigation pods down here. In fact, the original Block 1 and Block 5s weren't even suited for it. They also would have a smaller tail originally before that was all introduced. But yeah, these are now out of Israeli service. Many of them were high flight hours, but 40 were declared refurbishable, and Israel looked to sell them off. I know Jordan was a contender at one time to buy them, so some of them are still worthy. Probably those were the newer ones given by the U.S. Air Force. Neat. I like early F-16s. Next up we have the two-seater Barak. If someone knows about the whole spine thing, please let me know. It is worth pointing out that in the 2010s, Israel would upgrade their C and D fleet to what they called the 2020 standard, a midlife upgrade program. So they're still flying, although they really do like the Ds here on this model. We still don't have the slot for the tank, so that's why I don't have it on one of the other stands, because it's an older one. It does have the Python missile here. That was a kind of a Israeli localization. Otherwise it has the older Sidewinder and the newer guided bombs and tanks. And it just has the one pod. Originally, Israeli F-16s used the sharpshooter pod, and then they would use the French-made, the Rafale Lightning pod at some time, but they've also been photographed using the full Lantern pod setup too, so different things. In 2006, which is when this model is from, they had a war with Lebanon, and that would be the first time the F-16I would see active combat, but primarily the C's and the D's were the main ones, and that's actually what this is from here. This is called the UAV killer, the unmanned aerial vehicle killer. It took part in shooting them down. But by this point, these are primarily being used for ground attack, as the F-4s are retired. And again, they were upgraded and updated to a new standard so they can continue flying for at least another decade in Israel. And the two batches of Lightnings here, Bracks, well, that's, they had quite a large number, and many are still in service. A few have been lost to accidents over the years, and a couple have been shot down thanks to air-to-surface. But I really like this one. The spine, it does make it unique and distinctly Israeli. So what do you think? Plus the Python missiles, those are cool too. And finally, we'll pretend like this is an F-16I. Just pretend like there's a Python there. Everything else is pretty straight and correct. Like I said, they had their combat debut in 2006, and Israel would actually lose one of these in that war. But it wasn't through anything from the enemy. It was actually an accident on takeoff. One of the tires would burst, sending the aircraft out of control, and the crew would safely eject. And they would continue to see quite a bit of use. One would be shot down by a Syrian-controlled surface-to-air missile in 2018, and a few others have been lost over time. But it was the F-16I that kind of led to the upgrade of the F-16C and Ds. They updated those to have the same or similar avionics and weapons compatibility, and probably will continue for quite some time. Greece was actually the first nation to fly one of this configuration. Poland, of course, here, Israel. So it's mostly an export thing, not really for the U.S. Air Force, but it's definitely a cool design. And it can really be loaded up with fuel tanks. And because of that, it can carry quite a bit of ordnance. It does have a quite a bit heavier all-up weight compared with the original F-16s, but, you know, it's specialized for ground attack and just other modern stuff. And like I said, they have 102 of these, or at least they purchased 102. A few have been lost, as I said. And I do find it a little interesting that they had the Pratt & Whitney engine versus the General Electric. But there's a good reason for that, because these are the same engines, or at least very similar to what are in the F-15Is. So, you know, compatibility is always a good thing. And there we have all 5 generations of Israeli fighting Falcon. The Netz II, the Barak II, and the Sufa. And they have a very interesting combat history, one way or the other, and really proved just what a good design the F-16 really is. How versatile, flexible, and, relatively speaking, economical too, which is not a common thing. And I'm glad that Hobby Master just released the one here this summer. Sorry, my cat is meowing. You know Hobo. She does not like being left out. And, you know, picking up the special edition from Akins for Epstein was neat too. So, I don't know. Just felt like doing this. Let me know what you think. I appreciate it. With that, this is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.